We now have our HTTP endpoint, which sends back the JSON forecast information. As we saw, this works well for valid addresses, and in the last video, we set it up to also work with invalid addresses. Now in this video, we're going to turn our attention towards our front end once again. The goal is to figure out how to make an HTTP request for that forecast data from client-side JavaScript in the browser. That's going to allow us to create a form, submit it, fetch the data, and then on the fly re-render the page to show that weather information. Over in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and start by closing all open files, and I'm going to collapse the Playground folder, and I'm also going to collapse the source directory in Web Server. We're going to spend our time in the public folder a little bit and in the templates folder a little as well. Now, the homepage of our site, this is the only page where we're actually going to fetch the forecast. The other pages aren't going to have that. You would just go to the weather page to actually get weather information. Now, that is the index.hbs view, and in here, you'll remember we linked in the JavaScript file that is in the JS folder called app.js. Now, out of our 4 views, that's the only one that has it. The other 3 files, 404, about, and help, they don't link it in, and that's intentional. The code that goes inside of here is going to be related to fetching the forecast, and since this is the only page that needs to fetch the forecast, it's the only page that needs this code. Now we're going to move over into our JavaScript directory. We have app.js. This is client-side JavaScript, which is going to run in the browser. The goal inside of here, amongst other things, is to be able to fetch the forecast information. In this video, we're not going to worry about actually creating the form or rendering the forecast data to the browser. We're going to focus on just getting the data inside of our client-side JavaScript. Once we have it inside of the client-side JavaScript, the rest is pretty easy. Now, to actually make the HTTP request from client-side JavaScript, we'll be using the very popular Fetch API. Fetch is not part of JavaScript. It is a browser-based API, which means it's something we can use in all modern browsers, but it's not accessible in Node.js. So the code we write inside of here isn't going to be something you'll be able to use in a back-end Node script. Here, this script is running in client-side JavaScript, so using the Fetch API is perfectly fine. We're going to explore the Fetch API by working with a dummy JSON endpoint I used in a different class. Then, as your challenge for the video, you'll actually fetch this JSON data in the client-side JavaScript file. Now, the other API, which we're going to start with, you can find at puzzle.mead.io/puzzle. This is a very simple API. It sends back a JSON response. We have a single property puzzle, and we have a word puzzle. In my JavaScript Bootcamp class, this was used to create a Hangman game. If you make the request again, you get a different puzzle each time. Handmade GIFs, perfectly pressed uniform, coffee beans. So our goal is to figure out how to get this data in the client-side JavaScript file. Then you'll use what we've learned to get this data in the client-side JavaScript file. Now, fetch is a function, so we're going to call it as such, and we pass to it a string. This is the URL we're trying to fetch from. Now, for the puzzle API, that would be http://puzzle.mead.io/puzzle. This is going to give us back a randomly generated puzzle. Now, calling fetch in our client-side JavaScript is going to kick off an asynchronous I/O operation, much like calling a request in Node.js did. That means we don't have access to the data right away. Instead, we provide a function, and that function will run at some point in the future when the data is available. Now, with the request function in Node, we passed a callback as the second argument to the function. With the Fetch API, it's actually slightly different. Instead, we use the then method on the return value from fetch, and we provide to it the callback function we want to run. And we get access to the response as the first and only argument up above. Then inside of here, we can use the response to do whatever we want to do, like extract the data and render it to the browser or just dump it to the console. So right here, we're saying fetch data from this URL and then run this function. Now, the then method is part of a much bigger API we'll be exploring later in the class known as promises. We're going to explore promises and its companion async await in detail in just a couple of sections when we learn how to connect Node.js to a database. For the moment, we're not going to worry about diving into the details of promises or async await, but don't worry, you'll use both extensively in the second half of the class. So right here, we have access to the response, and the goal is to just get the data, to get that string puzzle and do something simple with it, like render it to the browser or dump it to the console. We have access to that on response. It is response.json, which we're going to call as a function, since it is one. We don't pass any arguments to it, and this is also designed to work with then. So I'm going to add on a call to then, and I'm going to pass in a callback function. This function is going to run when the JSON data has arrived and been parsed. Right here, we have access to the parsed data, so a JavaScript object, as the first and only argument passed in. I'm going to call that data, and down below, we can actually use it. So that would be console.log data to dump that console to the terminal. Later on, we'll be using different methods for the browser to actually render data like the location and the forecast to the user interface that the user sees. What I'm going to do is go ahead and save app.js, and then inside of the browser, I'm going to crack open the Chrome Developer Tools, which we have used before. In the menu, it is More Tools, Developer Tools, and once again, we're looking for the console tab, and here we have our one message we print on line 1 of the file. Client-side JavaScript file is loaded. We're not seeing our second message since we haven't refreshed the page. But if I do, we are going to see down below, when the page loads, we now have two things showing up. I have 1, my message from before, and 2, an object with a puzzle property. And this puzzle is bags of fertilizer. Now, this is the exact same structure we saw when we cracked open the endpoint in the browser and viewed the JSON over here. So using those few lines of code in Visual Studio Code, we were able to fetch JSON data from a URL, parse it into a JavaScript object, and then do something with it, in this case, just dumping it to the console. Now it's challenge time, and it's going to be up to you to use fetch once again. Instead of fetching a puzzle, you're going to use fetch to fetch forecast information from the URL that we've set up. Now, once again, for the moment, don't worry about creating a form or actually rendering the forecast to the browser. That's something we'll start on in the very next video. For now, the goal is the following: just to fetch the weather. So step 1, in this file, down below the comments, you're going to set up a call to fetch the weather data for Boston, so you can get the correct URL set up and passed into fetch. Then, once you have the results, you are going to parse the JSON like we did up above, and this is where you're going to do one of two things. If the JSON response has that error property, you're going to print the error to the console. If there is no error, then you're going to print the location and the forecast to the console. And finally, you're going to go ahead and test your work. Down below, you'll refresh the browser to do that. Try once with Boston, make sure you see the location and the forecast, then go ahead and try again with something like an exclamation mark and make sure you see the error showing up. Take some time to knock that out, test your work, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by setting up our call to fetch. So right here, I am going to call fetch, passing in a string URL, and I can grab that from the browser where I already have it. In this case, I'm getting the weather for Philadelphia. The challenge was to get it for Boston, though quite honestly, any location would work just fine. So I can take this URL and I can bring this over to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to paste it right inside of here, and now we have our URL set up. And from here, we're going to use then to set up our callback function once again. So .then, we provide the function to run when fetch is all done, and in this case, we know we get access to the response. Next up, we're going to go ahead and use the JSON method on response, so that's response.json. We also use then with this, and what do we get back? We know we get back that parsed data. So I'll set up another callback function for when that operation is done, and I'll get access to the data right here that you could have called this particular parameter anything you liked. Next up, we want to use a little conditional logic to check if things went right or if things went wrong. Right here, what I'm going to do is check if there is an error. So if data.error, then we're going to do one thing, print the error message. Otherwise, in the else clause, we'll do the other thing, print the location and the forecast. So right here, let's knock that out. Console.log data.error. Then down below, we'll have 2 logs for those 2 values. In the next video, we'll transition these logs from logging to the console to rendering to paragraphs in the browser. So right here, I'll use log to go ahead and dump data.location, then I'll dump the forecast just down below. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, the last thing to do is to test our work with a working example and a not working example. We already have Boston inside of there, so let's go ahead and test that. On the home page of our weather website, I'll refresh the page, and I do indeed get my forecast information showing up, which is fantastic. Now that we have it, it's going to be really easy to render it to the browser. Next up, let's make sure that when things go wrong, our code knows how to respond. So I'll swap the address out for an exclamation mark. I'll refresh the browser once again, and this time around I can see unable to find location, try another search prints, and this is something we're also going to show to the browser if it actually occurs. We want to provide our users with the most useful information possible so they know what exactly is going on and why. All right, that is it for this video. In this video, we explored the Fetch API, which is really the only time we're going to use it since it is client-side JavaScript and the bulk of this course is server-side JavaScript with Node. Now, Fetch allows us to fetch data from a URL and do something with it. While we used Fetch, we also touched on the idea of something called promises. We don't need to know anything about them for the moment. Remember, they are covered in detail shortly in the class. Up above, I'm going to go ahead and remove the challenge comments, and I'm also going to remove the other fetch call which fetched the puzzle. We just use that to explore how the API works. Now that we have the forecast information in client-side JavaScript, in the next video, we're actually going to create a form, and we're going to get this information rendered in the browser as opposed to having it dumped in the Developer Tools console. I'm excited to get to that, so let's go ahead and jump right in to the next one.